Welcome back to part 2 of ex13 slideshow, and we're going to jump right into the coding. Before we open up our JavaScript and start doing any of that, we'll open up our index, and I'll double click to open this up. And one thing I just want to point out is we do have a link to our CSS file. That's the one that that's our presentation that affects how it looks. And there's a little comment in here. Remember, this is an HTML comment when it has the bracket, the exclamation point, 2 dashes, and it finishes up with 2 dashes and an arrow and a bracket or a greater than sign. That's typically where you can put your JS file, your link to your JS file, but we can move it down to the bottom, but we'll leave it at the top first so you see why we'd even move it to the bottom. But here's our CSS, so that's our typical link ref, link rel. The ref is, and if these are in different orders, it's not a big deal, but the ref is actually where the file, that's the reference of where it's going to, and the rel is telling that it's a style sheet, and then the type is just a text CSS, because we're going to have that same thing for JavaScript. So as long as we're in here, let's put a link to our JavaScript in here, and we'll put it right at the top first. So I'll put it right below here, and the way we're going to do this, it says down here, use script type source. So I'm going to put it up here first. And they actually use one, it's not a link, it's called script, and you could do source. You could do source first if you want. And the source is going to be the file just like the ref. So in quotes, I'll just put equal, and then I'll put quotes, and it's going to be slideshow.js. And just keep in mind that there's a capital S in there. So I'll do slideshow.js, and then we'll know pretty soon if that works or not. So the order, again, like this one, doesn't matter. And then I'll put a space, and I'll put type. They use something called type equals. And then I'm just going to put text slash, and they call it JavaScript. That's the way this is set up. Just like this one is text slash CSS. This is called text slash JavaScript. And then we're going to finish this up with our closing script tag. So it actually does have a closing script tag in here, whereas the link ref or the link rel does not. Okay, so very important to know that this does have a opening and closing script. And I mentioned before about this weird coloring, and this actually goes away if you just keep it at the margin, although now it's not. So there's my script tag. So this is going to be linking to an external JavaScript file that we're going to be working in. So we don't have to do it all in here. This is just our HTML code that's in here. So source equals slideshow.js, and then we have type equals text slash JavaScript, just like text slash CSS up there. We don't use a rel. And that's all we need here, opening and closing script tags. And again, we're probably going to be moving that to the bottom, but we'll start here by putting it up at the top. So that links to that. And then also, I just want to point out, I'll open up the CSS because we don't have to do anything here, but we'll just take a look at it. Just 3 elements are targeted in the CSS. The body has a width of 75%. Margin auto, which basically just centers all our information on a page. It centers the body because it puts auto margin on either side. And then a text align center, which means it just aligns all the text and the elements inside them to the center. So text align center is a little different than margin. Margin can center the entire element, body element, but you could still have left justified text in there. And then the buttons are just, the text on the buttons are a little bigger. And then our image, we just put a border on it. Just look at this one here. See, that's what that does. That just puts there's a 1 pixel border on there, and that's all it does. And then our body is basically 75% of the width, so there's margin on either side, and then the text in here is all centered, including the buttons. So that's what we have there. So we're pretty much, we don't have to do anything with our CSS. So I'm going to close that up. We're linking to it correctly, and if we'll check it out. And then our index, after we put in this in, that's all we should have to do to start. We might have to go back to it, and I'm going to keep it open because we may want to be looking at our ID names and things like that, because we're going to have to be very familiar with what our ID names are, because that's where things are going to have to show up. Notice our picture is going to show up in this SS pick area, okay? And we're going to have to get IDs to kind of find things and all that. So we are going to have to leave this open. So I'll just save what I have so far. And then we're going to go into our slideshow.js. So I'm going to open this up, and I do have a lot of comments in here to kind of help you out, but there's not as much JavaScript in here to actually deal with. I left the first one here. We started working with this. This is a function expression, which actually uses a variable to represent a function. And we're going to be using that again, because that's kind of almost more common by using this method of using kind of function expressions. And the only thing you have to remember about a function expression is you do need a semicolon, or you should. I think it works without it, but you should have a semicolon at the end of the curly bracket, where if you started off with function and then give it a keyword, it doesn't necessarily need that. So this, remember, is just used to do a shortcut, so we don't have to type this whole long thing all the time. This kind of, it returns that statement, so we can just use the $sign to represent that. And it just kind of, it's a little self-contained function that works as a shortcut for us. So we're going to have an array of all our images. Then we're going to have variables, one to represent x, because x is going to be the index number, and because that's going to have to go up and down so we could cycle through our slideshow. And then it also length, because we're going to want to know the length of our array, because that's going to be helpful for us too. Console log, this is where we're going to do some debugging, and we're going to have to move some of these things around. And then we're really going to have, I think there's something here I need to get rid of. Let me get rid of that. Make sure I fix that on the file that you download. So these things here, if you see anything in there, there shouldn't be anything in there right now, so other than this. So I'll make sure I try and fix that. But if you jump on it real quick and you see those things, or get those out of there. So there's going to be kind of two functions, and we're going to do them as variables. We're going to do them as function expressions like this. We'll use that method. So it's not much different than the other methods of using functions. And then we're just going to use our button on-click events. Instead of putting our on-click events right inside the button, we're going to put them down here, and we're going to just get their ID and then just run the function expression, which is actually kind of a variable. We're actually just going to attach it rather than kind of run it. We're going to attach it to the buttons, and they're going to basically run them, so we don't have to put them back in the HTML. So that's what we're going to do. So we'll get started with, the easiest stuff first. I like to start with the easiest stuff and start building up. We're going to make an array here to start, and we're going to have to, I'll just open my image so I look at them, and I'll just start my array. And if you remember, we're going to make a variable that represents the array. So we're going to say var, and we're going to call the array ssPix, and I'll use a capital P on there. And we are going to use sspic and sspix. Pix is the array. So I'll call var sspix, and we'll just define that it's a new array to start. It'll be a new array object, and we just have to put array with a capital A and or opening closing parentheses, and then we're just going to put the images in our array. And one thing I just want to point out, there's different ways to put these in. We're going to do it the simple way first, but it's recommended to create a new image object on one line and then create the kind of image source on the next line, because it can preload our images and make them quicker when they're online. But we're going to do it the simple way first, because that's the way we've done it in the past. So we'll do it like this first, because you probably won't see a huge difference in doing it. But the way we would do this is you'd basically say ssPix, give the array name, and then you'd put in your index number in there, and then you'd basically say equals and put the URL of the image. So the first one would be in quotes, because you'd want to put those in quotes. You'd want to put img, because that's the folder, and then you're going to put ac0.jpg, and that's our first image. And then we can copy all this stuff, because then we could just replace the zeros with ones and twos and threes. But make sure that's like that first, put a semicolon, and then we're going to have basically 5 more. So we're going to copy these and paste. There's 3, 4, 5, 6 all together. So we're just going to, I'll just go through this manually, and then I'll go back and change these so they go 0 through 5. Okay, that's our array. So that's all we need for our array so far. And that's good. So I'll even back this up one, and then it says we need vars for length and x. All right, so let's make a var, and we'll just call it ssPix length, and we'll use capital letters in there. So that's going to be ssPix length. That's the length of that. And what we're going to say it's equal to, we're going to say ssPix dot length. It's equal to the property, and I think it's a small l when we do that. We'll put length in there, and I'll put a semicolon. I don't think there's any parentheses in there. So we're going to use this to represent length. So what would the length be? Well, length is how many images are in the array. That's what the length of the array means. So it's, instead of having to do this will basically equal 6. So if we ever add to them, then it'll be 7, it'll be 8, whatever. So if you ever add images to your slideshow, this already represents the length of that. So, and we are going to have to use that, because we're going to use that as a kind of consideration as far as how far we go when we start kind of hitting our next button through our throw a slideshow. So one other thing, it says var x. Well, this one's easy. Var x equals 0, because we're going to start with 0, because x is actually going to represent that. So we're going to start with that, and I'll put a semicolon. So we're going to declare that first, or initialize that first. Console log, don't worry about this. We're going to use this for testing, so we're going to skip over that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create our function here, and it's called ssNext. It says var, but it's really going to be a function. So the way this is going to start up, it's going to be var, and we're going to call it ssNext for slideshow next. And when we do this, we're going to say equals function, and then we're going to put our opening and closing curly brackets. So this is where a function is going to be. This is the same thing as if we said this. I'll just put this here, then I'll erase it. If we said function ssNext, same thing, and we did curly brackets. This will work the same way, except this way we could send this through buttons. This seems to be more of the common way that it's used. This is a function expression. This is kind of a declaration here. So this is a little more common, so we're going to use that, but it's really not much different. We just set a variable that equals the same name. The only thing we have to remember here is it's usually recommended to put a semicolon after with this method, because we're kind of declaring a variable even though there's a function inside here. So that's all we're doing here. And then again, once we make this, we'll be able to copy it. So what we want to do here, and we're going to need something called an if-else statement. We're going to need a conditional statement, because we're going to know what's going to happen if it goes up or down. So we're going to want to increment this so that it starts going up when we click on the button. So this is going to click on the button. So first thing we want to do is we probably want to increment our x. And the way we're going to do that, we could go in here, and we could put this here. We could put x. The way we're going to increment, you could do something like this. Say x equals x plus 1. And we're going to use a shortcut for that. That's kind of incrementing, but the shortcut for incrementing is, instead of doing x equals x plus 1, is basically just to do x plus plus. That's another way to do it, x plus plus. Now we may want to increment after we know if we can increment yet. So we may want to put this inside our if statement. So we'll leave it here, but then we may have to put it inside our if statement. So we're going to do an if statement, and we're going to say if, and we only want to increment basically is if we're kind of below the limit, because if we're at 5 or we're at 6 or we're at our limit of the length of what our array is, we don't want to go any further. So we basically want to say if x is less than, I'll put a space in here, it's less than ss_pix length. If it's less than ss_pix length, that's kind of what we want to make sure happens here. So if it's less than the length here, now we have to put curly bracket here, and I'm also going to put an else in here. I'll put else, and I'll put those brackets. That way we know we have 6 brackets. We have 1 for our function, our ssNext function, and then we also have 2 for our if and 2 for our else. So our first condition here is if x is less than ss_pix length. Well, what's going to happen there? Well, I'm pretty sure we're going to increment that. But what's going to happen if x is less than pix length? We're going to basically display, because what's going to happen is we need to display our image. And now let's look at our HTML and find our ID. Here's our image. Now we have a div that has an ID, and we have a paragraph that doesn't have an ID, but we have an image that has an ID. And it's called ss_pic singular. Okay, so that's what we need to know there, ss_pic singular. So if I go back to here, I basically we can use this shortcut up here. Remember, this is the one we could use the $sign and then the ID. So we're going to put the $sign, and then in parentheses, it's called ss_pic. And we should put quotes on there, and I didn't put them in yet. And what we do want to put is src. We want to say the source of that, the image source, because that's kind of the property is source. Because otherwise there's all different properties there. And what I mean is, if you look at this, there's our ID, but there's also a property called source, there's a property called alt. So we want to make sure for that ID we're using the source property. So that's why we're putting .source in there, so it knows what we're talking about. And then what we're going to do is we're going to display, we're going to set that to. It's $, so we're going to set that to, and it's basically going to be set to our array, which is ssPix, and then in the brackets there where we typically put the index number, we're going to put x, because x should be equal to whatever that is. We should be able to just put a semicolon. So what should happen here is that should basically increment it up. Now I think what we're going to have to do, I'm going to take this out now because I'm pretty sure this is going to have to go here. Because what's going to happen if x is less than that, that's when we want to increment. We don't want to increment actually before that. We want to make sure, because since we're using an if, we want to make sure that it's less than the length in order to increment. So as long as it's either 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or I guess 4, because that would be the fifth one, as long as it's less than the length, we'll make sure that it's incrementing. Now here's the issue that's going to happen, that we're going to run into, is even if it's at the last one, it may increment it. So we may have to do something to adjust that a little bit. So, but anyway, this looks okay so far. And what's the else here? What happens if it's not? Well, then we're actually going to do something that's just called return. And we could just say return x. Or we could just say return. What return does in JavaScript is it kind of almost exits the function. Usually you could return a value, and returning a value or returning nothing isn't really going to make a difference here. So we're just going to say return, because that kind of means almost do nothing. Just return, meaning kind of stop the function, stop kind of cycling through this. Stop cycling through the if and else. So it should do whatever is after here should just kind of move on then. But that's all we should need so far. You know, that function looks pretty good. How do we know if it's right yet? Well, we don't, because we're gonna have to see if it works first. You're just gonna have to trust me on this. But that's what we're trying to do. We're basically plugging in x, just like we did with random numbers, into there. And then what we're gonna do next is we're gonna do our back button, and then we're gonna try it out. So let me take a break here. So far we did our array, we set up our variables, and we set up our first function. Then we're going to set up our back function, and then we're going to get our buttons working and then we're going to start to troubleshoot. So that's the end of part 2. We'll continue that with part 3.